Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. When we last left our heroes, we had kind of looked at the foreign policy developments of the 15-year or so period after World War II, going into the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs situation. The Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, all this kind of stuff. I do want to. There's one thing that I think I neglected to mention by accident in our last set of videos, which was the Berlin Wall incident. So, come 1962, East Germany, the communist side of Germany, is having an increasingly hard time keeping people inside of Germany, inside of East Germany, because if you remember, the city of East Berlin is so the city of West Berlin is located entirely within the borders of East Germany, but it belonged to West Germany. And of course, you had the crisis there, earlier when Stalin was premier, where we had to resort to the Berlin airlift and all this kind of stuff. But now, so many East Germans have escaped into West Berlin that the Soviets are having a hard time keeping the city functioning at the level they want it to, because people keep leaving. So what they had to do, what they ultimately decided to do, was to build a wall to keep people inside their own country, because there was just a radically different quality of life, whether depending on which side of the border you were on. I once upon a time went to a church that had some missions churches in Germany, and so oftentimes, 3 or 4 occasions, Germans would want to come visit America and stay at with the mother church for a little while. So sometimes we would let them stay at our house because we had some extra room at the time, and you could see a very marked difference between the families that grew up in East Germany versus the ones that grew up in West Germany. Like the ones that grew up in East Germany, you still kind of see them kind of looking over their shoulder, very sheepish. The ones from West Germany tended to be a little bit more, comfortable, in America. So, the years of paranoia and looking for secret police, it made a big impact kind of on the culture of the region there. So ultimately, though, they wound up building this massive wall, and I need to mention that to set up, later on in a week or two when we talk about the fall of the Berlin Wall. I just want you to have context for how big a deal that is going to be for the people of Eastern Europe, and how it relates to the ultimate American victory in the Cold War. But now, with that out of the way, I want to kind of shift our attention to domestic politics in the Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy years, and we'll kind of end the discussion right at the moment where Kennedy would be unfortunately assassinated. We'll pick up in the next video with that. So anyway, so Harry Truman kind of inherits the presidency from Roosevelt, and he is now considered to be a very good president by most people. I think there's a pretty good bipartisan consensus on that. I'm very, very rarely going to give a Democrat credit for being a good president, but I like Truman pretty well. And yet, at the time, he was not that popular. There's a handful of reasons why. One was some just economic recession that happened for a stretch during his presidency. That is not really his fault per se. Then there was, but then there was this general sense that we were losing the Cold War. In hindsight, Truman's doing a lot of the things that set up our ultimate victory, so which is why his presidency looks better in hindsight than it did at the time. Because we look back now and see how big the Marshall Plan was, how big the Truman Doctrine was, how big NATO and SEATO were. And so we look back at all of these ideas, this policy of containment that he ultimately adopts, and we realize that he kind of set us on the path toward winning the Cold War, even though it was a decades-long process. But at the time, a bunch of bad things happened while Truman was president, and he kind of got blamed for some of them unfairly. So For instance, the Korean War, not an especially popular uh, deal. I mean, it didn't spur the kind of protests that Vietnam would, in the '60s and '70s. But there was a little bit of war fatigue from fighting World War II. So there's a handful of people who didn't think we ought to be there, and then a lot of those that do think we ought to be there would have sided with MacArthur and said no, we should have like invaded China and gone the whole way. So he kind of took heat from both sides with the way he was trying to fight Korea. You had problems with uh, Korean. I lost my train of thought here for a second. Hold on, my train of thought has been derailed. But so there were just just stuff like the Soviets getting the nuclear bomb. I mean, it happened on his watch, right? What was he supposed to do to stop it, right? But it kind of caused this general sense of panic. The communists winning the Chinese Civil War was another thing that was we talked about. This, when we talked about the kind of year of shocks that was 1950. So there was a general. So Truman was not especially popular at times, but he's actually going to win re-election in a surprising upset. We'll talk about kind of how that happened. So some of probably the most important thing he did on domestic policy, and this is where I might differ with Truman on some of this. But he passed a series of bills that is known as the Fair Deal, which was basically an extension or his personal spin on the New Deal, basically taking kind of that New Deal welfare state and expanding it a little bit. One of the things, some of the things that Truman wanted to do that I would have had a problem with are things that he was not able to get passed. Because of the Republican Congress that was there at the time, and so when I say Truman was a good president, I think his presidency worked out well. I think if he'd had a Democratic Congress at the time, he would have done more things that I would have disagreed with. But because he was trying to do a handful of things like that I might not be a big fan of, like. He kind of wanted to start a national health care program, not terribly dissimilar to what actually passed in, Obama's day. It probably would have been a lot more simplistic back then. But he did want to have some kind of nationalized health care program, which I would not have supported, and a handful of other things like that. He did expand Social Security and a few other programs. He kind of had an idea for the government to try to bankroll full employment, which doesn't necessarily mean each and every person, but it would have taken a more active role in trying to guarantee jobs and that sort of a thing. That didn't materialize. But and in fact, what's funny is one of the most important bills of his time was actually a bill that passed over his veto, that he vetoed, and then the Congress overrode the veto. He hated it, and that was the Taft-Hartley Act, which the Taft-Hartley Act went back and changed some of the labor laws to kind of favor ownership over labor again in certain situations. One of the things that happened is with the Taft-Hartley Act is it allowed states to pass what they call right-to-work laws. And right-to-work laws, where that comes from is that in some before Taft-Hartley, due to the Progressive era and the New Deal era, basically the laws that had been passed during those eras had favored labor unions over ownership in such a way that if a labor union, if a business was a union shop, you could make it to where you literally were not able to work in that industry without paying dues to the union. So Taft-Hartley allowed states to carve out exceptions to that so that you could have the right to go to work even if, the union was striking and you wanted to go work. So nowadays, a lot of states have gone to right to work, including a lot of states like West Virginia that once upon a time you would have thought, they're union strongholds and they'd never go right to work. So, and typically right to work states, I think that has kind of been a good policy decision for most of them that have done that. One important thing he did was he signed a law called the National Security Act that kind of reorganized kind of some of the military and security apparatus, created the post of Secretary of Defense, and kind of set up the modern Defense Department. Obviously, they had already had that basic same figure under the title of Secretary of War. But the modern Department of Defense, the way the Pentagon is set up now, dates back to Truman's presidency. Truman is also the president who signs into being the existence of the CIA and the National Security Council. So a lot of the modern national security apparatus dated back to Truman's administration. So he's running for re-election in 48, and he's not polling very well, and he's got problems on both his left and right wings. You got to understand, political parties were not the way they are now for a couple more decades. What I mean by that is nowadays there's a pretty strong ideological difference between Republicans and Democrats. It really wasn't like that, though, in these days. In fact, there's something of a moderate consensus. The vast majority in the post-war era, from the end of World War II all the way until maybe as late as the mid-70s. I mean, maybe as late as the Reagan years, to be honest. I mean, is probably the moment it changed. Up until that time, you kind of had a kind of policy consensus in America that was basically fairly socially conservative and fairly economically liberal. And that's kind of the way things were from 45 until the mid-70s. I think there's an economic malaise in the 1970s, which kind of turns people against the economic liberalism side of that. And then there are some just social changes associated with the counterculture. It starts to turn a lot of people away from the socially conservative side of that. But that was kind of the consensus thing for the post-war years. And so where this is interesting is that in reality, a person's partisan affiliation was not necessarily a sign of how he voted or what position he took on any given issue, because you had, for instance, I mean, you had civil rights advocates and segregationists in both parties. You had isolationists and war hawks in both parties. You had pro-New Deal and people that would want to scale the size of government back in both parties. And so it's kind of a weird thing to look at now in this era where parties are more polarized. One, it was a little easier for people to work together back then, in some ways. But then also, if you are someone who tends to be a more extreme liberal or conservative, you could also say, well, we couldn't get anything done either. Well, anyway, so the Democrats, were a coalition of interest, and as were the Republicans. The Republicans were maybe a little more ideological. But so Truman is having problems on his left wing because if you remember Henry Wallace, who had been FDR's VP, Truman had thrown him a solid and made him Secretary of Commerce, and then now, as we're finding out, as the Cold War is ramping up, and we're finding out kind of how close he was to the hard left in the communist associations, Truman has Wallace fired. So the hardcore progressives in the party are angry at him about that, and they actually split, and Henry Wallace runs as a third party called the Progressive Party, not the same as the one that Theodore Roosevelt ran on, not the Bull Moose Party, but a new progressive party that was pretty much an explicitly socialist platform. And they took, I think, maybe 5% of the vote nationwide. Then on his, which you might consider his right wing, you had a lot of the Southern Democrats were angry at Truman for taking steps in the direction of civil rights. Even though, Truman's not going to sign any sort of massive landmark legislation like what happens in 64 or anything like that, but he is going to kind of be taking baby steps in that direction, and he's less kind of less explicitly segregationist. He wants to like slowly move away from segregation. Well, that will not do for a lot of the Southern Democrats. And so a lot of the Southern Democrats actually split and start and run it's not even technical. It's sort of a third party, but it's almost more of a splinter faction within the Democratic Party that they referred to as the Dixiecrats. And the Dixiecrat candidate for president was Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, who was a congressman from, particularly a senator, from this period in time. I mean, back into the 1940s, all the way until President Bush 43. W. Bush was president. He was still in the Senate. He was a senator when he was in his 90s. So, I mean, he literally was in the Senate for like, 5 or 6 decades. And not a good person either in a lot of ways. He, at one point in time, voted against a lynching law during the FDR years. So, Strom Thurmond, ran on a very explicitly segregationist and anti-civil rights platform, and he actually won a couple electoral votes in the Electoral College. Like, there's actually a couple of states that Thurmond won, if I'm not mistaken. So typically, if you're the Republicans, you're looking at Truman's reelection and saying, "Oh, we've got this," because he's got the left and the right wings of the Democratic Party are leaving him, and he's just trying to hold the center together. And meanwhile, the Republicans are unified, and so they run a fellow by the name of Thomas Dewey, and it looks like Dewey is going to be winning. But Truman works hard. His base, he makes a kind of a slick move, which he calls a special section of Congress, begs them to do a request of them to do a bunch of things. They all refuse to do them, and Truman then used that as a weapon against them, and he runs his campaign against the fight against the do-nothing Congress that isn't doing anything for you. And somehow manages, even as the sitting president, to kind of run this sort of campaign against Washington, which is an interesting thing that he was able to pull off. By the time when everyone goes to bed, the early returns make it sound like Dewey's going to win. Not that you had the same level of media coverage that you have now, but newspapers had already printed the morning edition saying Dewey defeats Truman, because that's what all the polls looked like. And then the next day, it turns out that Truman actually, in a shocking upset, actually won the race and was reelected. And there's a famous picture, it's in your textbook, of Truman holding up the newspaper that says Dewey defeats Truman, laughing, because, as you know, because Thomas Dewey never became the president of the United States, contrary to what the Chicago Tribune said. So, so once he got in there, he kind of expanded on his fair deal proposals. They raised the minimum wage, they extended Social Security coverage, increased farm aid. However, he was not able to get civil rights bills or national health care through Congress. So, one of the defining issues of the Truman-Eisenhower era is the issue of Soviet espionage and the presence of communists in high places in American society. If you remember, after World War I, there was this period of time that they called the Red Scare, as associated with the Palmer raids and all that kind of stuff. We have what's called the Second Red Scare in the 1950s. And this was a time where a lot of people became deeply alarmed at the thought of communist infiltration of high places, and some of this, especially in the hands of a demagogue, that is a rabble-rouser, politician by the name of Joseph McCarthy, kind of turns into a fever pitch that they call the Second Red Scare. You had people like, you had an ultra right-wing group called the John Birch Society that was accusing President Eisenhower of being a communist party agent at this point in time, to which the famous retort was someone made this accusation in public one time, and I can't remember who it was that said it back, but he said, Eisenhower is not a communist, he's a golfer. So you have this period of time, though, where there really is for years, the conventional wisdom was the second Red Scare is a bunch of hysteria, and that there's only a handful of the communist spies and it wasn't a big deal. We've come to find out once the Soviet Union fell and a lot of the Soviet documents were declassified, we found out that no, actually a lot of the accusations of the anti-communist movement were completely well-founded. There were very real problems, and they had a deep and extensive spy network that made a tremendous impact on the course of American history. Now, some of the problem was kind of taken care of by the time McCarthy got a hold of it. So McCarthy was kind of using a lot of it for political gain in kind of a unseemly way. I actually did my thesis in college on a defense of the anti-communist movement in the 1950s, which was a pretty bold thing to do on a college campus, but because a lot of people look at the anti-communist movement as like the peak of American hysteria and right-wing fanaticism and so on. I don't know if I'd entirely agree with everything I wrote when I was in college either. I think I've become a little more sensitive to some civil liberties stuff than I probably was at the time. I was writing just a couple years after 9/11, and the mood of the country was get the bad guys whatever the cost. And now I'm looking back on it. I'd probably tweak that paper if I could tweak it again. But the core of it is legit, which is the fact that there was a very, very real communist spy problem. And it was actually probably more extensive than a lot of people even knew. So the first real signs of this whole communist spy thing unraveling are when a man by the name of Whittaker Chambers, who later writes a 700-page book called Witness, that's really one of the founding documents of the modern American conservative movement. Chambers was an actual Soviet spy. He was an American communist who literally spied for the Soviet Union. He had a religious conversion and came to Christ, and decided that and was offended by the fact that the communists allied with the Nazis during the invasion of Poland back at the start of World War II, which caused him to realize that they weren't kind of creating the utopia he thought. And then he becomes increasingly aware of some of the terrible things that the Stalinist regime were doing. So the combination of his new faith and his increasing awareness of the evils of Stalin caused him to switch sides in the fight. And so he goes to law enforcement, and he goes to the Congress and starts naming names of high-ranking officials, especially within the State Department, that he shared intelligence with. And the most notable of these is a man by the name of Alger Hiss, who we mentioned a couple of videos ago, is President Roosevelt's primary advisor at the Yalta Conference. And if you remember, the Yalta Conference was the moment that set up the chessboard for the Cold War, and did it in such a way that it gave Stalin a tremendous advantage at the opening of that contest, so to speak. So the fact that Alger Hiss may have been a Soviet spy, and people, especially on the right, were already kind of, railing at what happened at Yalta, and then you come to find out that Roosevelt's main advisor was a spy. Well, Alger Hiss denied it. Accused, Chambers of all sorts of personal improprieties, some of which were real, some of which were not. But Chambers is able to prove that his testimony was true by providing documents that were known as the Pumpkin Papers. And the way they got that interesting title was he was concerned that the communists would destroy the documentation he had of the work he'd done for them. So he had it copied onto microfilm, which was a type of film, like the film you would have on a camera, sort of. But it was a particular type of film that you were able to shrink images really low, so that you could have rolls of microfilm and keep a lot of it was kind of like an analog way of keeping a lot of records. And so he had all these records on this cache of microfilm, and he hid the film in a pumpkin, in a hollowed out pumpkin inside of a pumpkin patch, and was able to tip the FBI to where it was, and lo and behold, it kind of validated what he was saying. So connected with this, the House of Representatives opens a committee known as HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it was chaired by a young California congressman by the name of Richard Nixon, who's going to be an important player for the next 20 odd years of American politics. So, and so they start investigating, again, the communist spy rings. They have these famous hearings and they're looking into, communist infiltration of Hollywood, of Wall Street. I mean, just of any, basically anywhere you could look. One area where we had a lot of spies for real was the State Department. And President Truman, to his credit, came in and issued some orders to basically, deal with a lot of the security risk inside of the State Department. And so the problem is, we'll get to the emergence of McCarthy in a minute. The problem with McCarthy is that Truman had already done a lot of what McCarthy was saying needed to be done. So, particularly liberals who want to say, oh, McCarthy was just full of it, he was a lie, there was no problem. Well, that's not true. The problem is it's hard to fully defend what he did because some of it was kind of grandstanding and ignoring the fact that some of the issue had already been dealt with. The other major spy ring that was uncovered, besides Alger Hiss and all that, was one that was led directly to the Soviet acquisition of the atomic bomb. There was a American couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. That Ethel's brother was one of the research scientists at Los Alamos in Alamogordo, New Mexico, which was the Air Force base where they actually tested the atomic bomb. They actually had the research laboratory there. And this is like where they developed the A-bomb. And he was feeding information through his sister and brother-in-law, and they were feeding it to the Soviet Union. They were feeding it to Joseph Stalin. And ultimately, they get caught for it. The brother-in-law turned state's evidence to avoid execution. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are actually convicted of treason and espionage, and actually are sentenced to die by the electric chair. And so they actually are electrocuted to death for their role in the Soviets gaining the nuclear bombs. The other major spy who was in that was a fellow by the name of Klaus Fuchs. I have to be very careful to pronounce that name properly. It's a terrifying one to say at all ages thing. But Klaus Fuchs was another one of these scientists who was spreading nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. And then there was, in England, there was a group of spies at Cambridge led by one Ken Philby who were involved in that as well. So the Soviets had a lot of people that were giving them nuclear secrets. Into the middle of this situation pops a Wisconsin senator by the name of Joseph McCarthy. He's probably the least popular senator in American history on a bipartisan basis. Although, again, I give him a little bit more credit than some people do, in the sense that he was raising awareness of an important issue, but he was doing it in a way that was reckless and irresponsible. And because he started throwing around like these really alarming charges. He made a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, where he basically accused the State Department and a number of other agencies of being kind of deeply infiltrated by communists. He claimed to have like a paper with like a list of names and all this stuff, many of which he couldn't quite back up. He publicly named names of suspects who turned out to have been innocent. And so, kind of the way he went about things, and he created this sense of paranoia where if you didn't like anything he said, he and his followers would kind of turn around and kind of accuse you of communism. And so it kind of created this just sense of hysteria. And it was kind of a hard time to be. If you were someone who had more liberal or progressive leanings in the 50s, you had you had to be wary that someone like McCarthy, wouldn't really publicly slander you as a communist and stuff like that. And so part of the reason why some of the more left-wing historians kind of don't want to give any credit to the problem here is because, if you were just, an innocent person with leftist views, you walked on eggshells through that era, and so then they want to, they didn't want to say that there was anything real going on there because they were acutely sensitive to the people that were falsely accused and so on. Ultimately, McCarthy is going to be censured by the Senate, which is like the next thing, like the next step away from being kicked out. So he wasn't kicked out, but he was officially reprimanded by the Senate for kind of his recklessness. A lot of the people that were linked to communism in some of these areas, were blacklisted or whatever. And there's a few industries that, or fields where you had a lot of prominent leftists who wound up getting kind of exiled culturally and so on. Before we move on to other matters, I do want to talk a little bit about what was some of this Soviet spy stuff. The coolest, my favorite tourist attraction in the world, I've mentioned it before, is the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., where, you find out that, those James Bond movies were a little less unrealistic than you thought they were, and it kind of makes you terrified to think what they could do now with everything they were able to do in the 50s and 60s. But back then, so some of the things that I saw there that were really wild that I figured you'd like to hear. So there was one time where the Soviets were building a new embassy. Of course, we knew that we were going to bug the place. They knew we were going to bug the place. So it was just a matter of when and where and how, right? And so we waited until they had a little bit of a false sense of security. We waited until they had swept the place for bugs, and we knew it. And we had a bug when we were, when the American company that was building the embassy or whatever, we placed a listening device or a bug inside a cinder block. And we had a very tiny drill that operated by remote. And when we found out that they had already swept the place for listening devices, we activated that remote and caused them to bore a little hole in a cinder block just big enough for them to be able to pick up the audio. It's just astounding. There was one particular thing that they did where they put listening devices in the pipes of the men's room in the Soviet embassy, and they were able to pick up certain audio from certain places. And then when someone would flush the toilet, the listening device was on a little parachute, and when someone would flush the toilet, we go down into the sewer. They had a CIA agent in the sewer ready to pick up the listening devices as they were flushed down the sewage system. So, just all sorts of insane, crazy things that we were able to do to figure out how to spy on the Soviets. And they did the same thing to us. They also had many of the same kind of innovations. So, Russian and American spies got really good at eavesdropping on each other and so on. So, we get to the end of the Truman years. It's 1952. I can't remember by now whether they had passed the constitutional amendment that they did away with the multiple terms past the second thing, or whether Truman just didn't, just wanted to go back to, the precedent of 2 terms and out. But either way, he's out, and he's replaced by a fellow by the name of Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson is a very respected person in liberal circles. He was a very intellectual, kind of stuffy type personality. There's a famous exchange about him where A reporter says, Mr. Stevenson, you know that you'll be the choice of every thinking man in November, and he famously says, so that'll do me no good. I need a majority. But ultimately, his opponent is going to be, probably the most respected man in America. General Dwight D. Eisenhower is chosen as the candidate on the Republican ticket. And of course, he was the hero of. He was in command at D-Day. He was in command in North Africa. He was in command, as they're marching through Germany. So that was going to be a hard thing to overcome. Especially, he was running on a pretty apolitical and kind of moderate ticket where he's not going to, really isolate a whole. He's not really going to alienate a whole lot of people on the other side anyway. And so Eisenhower wins relatively easily. He, you'll see buttons and campaign posters that have his famous campaign slogan, "I like Ike," which seems a little primitive, but at the time was considered a really important development in political campaigning. It's hard, I guess it beats mugwumps or whatever. But Eisenhower becomes president. He's a pretty good president in most senses, but conservatives are divided on Eisenhower because on one hand, really, almost nobody has been better at just like running the government. Like he was not extraordinarily hands-on. He was more a delegator. He put the right people in charge. Some of his job requirements as a general of just making sure that people in the right places running the army correctly, some of that translated fairly well to being president. And he was a very efficient president. Where he had some criticism on the right was that he's the first Republican president after the New Deal. And of course, when Roosevelt was president, the Republicans were generally opposing the New Deal. They're trying to push against it in some way. And Eisenhower is kind of the first time they've had a crack at rolling it back. And so Eisenhower has a very important decision to make. Am I going to try to undo what's now been basically 20 years of New Deal politics and go back to laissez-faire, government's hands off, or do I just embrace the new burgeoning welfare state that I inherited from Roosevelt and Truman and just try to manage it more efficiently? And to the consternation of many conservatives, he opted for option B. Eisenhower is the guy that has in his hands the opportunity to start trying to undo the New Deal and try to turn back time. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to just try to I'm just going to try to manage it well, and not grow the deficit, and just try to be a good manager. And so a lot of people on the right felt like he kind of wasted an opportunity. He also the New Deal and Fair Deal were still relatively were still very popular at this time. Like I said, the general American consensus from 1945 until the mid 70s is moderate economic liberalism, moderate social conservatism. Actually, what we probably consider to be more extreme social conservatism based on today's standards. And that's kind of what Eisenhower rolls with. But so Eisenhower, he has a phrase called dynamic conservatism as the phrase that he uses to kind of describe his philosophy. But basically, that meant keeping the liberal apparatus that had been established in place, but kind of keeping its growth smaller, although he did expand it in certain ways. So like one thing is that for the first time in 1955, minimum wage hits $1 an hour for the first time, which it had never been $1 an hour up until that time. Now, obviously, have to adjust that for inflation. I can't look at my trusty inflation calculator because I'm filming myself with my phone right now. But I'm sure it wasn't a ton of money even then. Although you could buy a lot more with $1 back then. He actually created a new health, education, and welfare department that's now known as Health and Human Services. He starts putting more federal funding into education. So he actually does a lot of things that would be. He expended Social Security to apply to a lot more people who didn't qualify for it originally. So in a lot of ways, he's kind of a, economically, he's a little bit center left, by the standards of the time. One thing that he did that was really important, we'll talk about his contributions in civil rights in the next video, but one of the things that he does that's really important is the establishment of the interstate highway system. He is the one who kind of pioneers the idea of building interstates up and down America for a couple reasons. One was to help facilitate interstate travel and make it easier, but the other was he wanted to have some roads that were built that could be wide enough to be used as emergency runways in the event of something really going down with the USSR. And so the original design for the interstate was for the roads to be wide enough that an airplane could land on them if in an emergency situation. They could take off and land out of it. And there are some people that kind of criticize some of the process of how the interstate got put in, as far as did you always draw the most efficient route and all that kind of stuff. But ultimately, that's a pretty big accomplishment that kind of has changed the way Americans are able to traverse the interstate, or able to traverse the country. He makes Eisenhower, we've mentioned some of what he does on foreign policy. He does kind of follow a brinksmanship style on Cold War things, where he's willing to kind of bow up and kind of push back against the Soviets. But at the same time, he was a little wary of some of the counsel he was getting from some of his national security advisors at times. And so he makes this kind of famous speech as he's leaving office, where he talks about warning his successors to beware of the quote-unquote the military-industrial complex. Because he's beginning to think that there were too many people that wanted foreign conflict for the sake of facilitating the business interest of defense contractors and so on. And so that was something that Eisenhower had some concerns about while he is president. So ultimately, Eisenhower is going to be a fairly popular president. On a pretty bipartisan basis. He actually has a lot of, some of his most fervent critics are actually on his right, and people that wanted him to dismantle the New Deal and didn't. And so, William F. Buckley, who's considered the father of the modern American conservative movement, as editor of National Review magazine, which is one of the first real conservative magazines in America, and kind of became the mothership of the intellectual conservative movement. Actually formed the magazine in opposition to Eisenhower. Not Roosevelt or Truman, because they were supposed to be a certain way. Eisenhower was the guy that could have fixed things and he didn't. And so, but ultimately Eisenhower's a pretty popular figure. But he retires after 8 years, and so 1960, we've got a pretty dramatic presidential race between a Massachusetts senator by the name of John F. Kennedy and Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. So Kennedy was the son of a extraordinarily wealthy Massachusetts family. They actually had made their money in bootlegging during Prohibition, but had taken all the money from their bootlegging empire and used it in investments and kind of perpetuated the wealth. And Kennedy was, when he ultimately does win, he becomes the youngest president ever elected. He was elected president at the age of 43. Kennedy runs in opposition to Nixon, and they have an extraordinarily close presidential race. One thing that's interesting about their presidential race, it's the first presidential race where television was a major deal, because TV starts kind of creeping more into American homes in the late 50s. I should say Eisenhower won re-election for his second term, actually in a rematch with Stevenson in 56. So somewhere between 56 and 60 is when the majority of Americans started to get televisions. And so Kennedy and Nixon put on America's first televised presidential debate. And there's this really interesting phenomenon where people that watched the debate on TV, when polled, said that Kennedy won. People that listened to the debate on the radio said that Nixon won. And the reason for that is simple. It's that on the radio you could hear Nixon winning the debate. On TV, Kennedy looked like a movie star and Richard Nixon did not, right? And so in reality, there's actually a kind of a hilarious story because Kennedy and Nixon were both, around Washington at the same time. And I saw in a documentary, I don't know for sure if this is true, but it was on TV, so don't blame me, blame the TV show. But if it's not, but they said that Kennedy and Nixon actually had an encounter at in the men's room of the Senate building. Like they just happened to be walking in at the same time or washing hands at the same time or something. And I guess I might have worded that wrong. That made it sound worse than it was. But anyway. Kennedy, knowing that it's just part of the nature of things, that when you go on TV, you put on makeup for the lights or whatever, planted a bug in Nixon's ear. Like, did you hear Senator so-and-so, went on TV and put on makeup for the camera? Like, insinuated things about his preferences, I suppose you could say, as a result of the fact that he put on makeup on TV and, got Nixon, but I can't believe he'd do that. I'd never do that. So he actually planted the seed of convincing Nixon not to wear makeup on TV. So then he gets under the lights and he's just sweating profusely and he looks terrible and washed out, and Kennedy's just standing there with makeup on his face, and so ultimately, that's going to be a big moment in the campaign, depending on whether you watched it on TV or radio. That's kind of the beginning of modern presidential politics in a lot of ways, because, we said really, McKinley and Bryan is the first modern presidential race at one level, but then the way that people think about campaigns now is so dependent on the presence of television. 1960 is another candidate for that, So ultimately, Kennedy wins the election and is actually a pretty decent president. He does have he's another moderate. He has some liberal instincts and he has some conservative instincts. So he starts. He gets elected. He makes this famous statement about, in his inaugural, about ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. He began a legislative program called the New Frontier, which was by now it seemed like, every president since Roosevelt has had to have, or really since Woodrow Wilson, now that I think about it, has had to have some kind of slogan for their list of proposals. And so his was the New Frontier. He started the Peace Corps, which was a project to send volunteers to help in poor countries. He's involved in beginning the funding of the space program, which was in response to the fact that the Soviets actually beat us to space. We're going to wind up beating them to the moon, as we'll talk about in a little bit here. But they put the first satellite, Sputnik was the name of it, orbiting the world, and they put the first man in orbit, Yuri Gagarin. And so we did not want the Soviets to get a strategic advantage in space. So Kennedy is involved in helping to initiate the space. I'm pretty sure it's Kennedy. Maybe it was Eisenhower, but I'm pretty sure it was Kennedy that started it. In 1961, there's a little bit of a recession. Kennedy responds by trying to launch a bunch of public works programs, including $5 billion for housing, financial aid to certain areas, increasing Social Security, raising the minimum wage. It is. Your book is confirming for me here that it is Kennedy that kind of really kickstarts the space program. They put in the Telstar satellite system, which was help the communications industry, and they challenged to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which wound up happening. So. But one thing that's interesting about, and we'll talk, we'll look at more at the civil rights movement and how the different presidents interacted with it in the next video, Kennedy's going to make some more baby steps towards civil rights, although he's going to move pretty slowly on that, to the irritation of a lot of civil rights leaders at the time, for a period of time. But one thing that Kennedy does that was a unquestionably good thing was the largest tax cut in American history. Kennedy, even though he was a Democrat and kind of a moderate liberal on economic things, he was absolutely committed to the Cold War. Like, he was no less of a hawk than Eisenhower or Truman. I mean, he was going to fight communism, and so he may have believed in a welfare state back home or whatever. He was going to go fight the commies. And so he was a real Cold Warrior, and he also was pretty good on tax policy. Eisenhower before him had been very good at budgeting. Like we had balanced budgets like the vast majority of the Eisenhower years. Kennedy is going to really come after the high tax rates. At the time that Kennedy became president, there were some marginal tax rates that were pushing. The top marginal tax rate was actually 90%, which meant that after a certain amount of income, any more than that, you got 90% of it taxed, which basically discouraged you from continuing to work at that point. Now, that was for millionaires who never really got there, and most of the people didn't actually pay those taxes because the people that were operating at that level of wealth could turn it into capital gains taxes and file them, play the loophole game and all that kind of stuff. So it's not that many people were actually paying that rate, but it was actually on the books. I mean, I can't even fathom. Even though I understand, like, the way it works, it doesn't mean that you give $9 out of $10 of your money to the government. In that case, it means that after a certain amount, any more that you get is going to be taxed at that rate. But even with that, I can't imagine anyone ever proposing that again. And I can't remember who was in charge when those rates came in, whether it was FDR or Truman or Eisenhower. But Kennedy brought them down dramatically, and it was the largest tax cut in American history until it was surpassed by Reagan's in the early 80s. And so that was a big thing for, American industry. So, and we'll kind of go, but in the next video, we'll kind of look at some of the social things going on in society during this stretch of time here. But should mention while we're talking about the Kennedys that America. One thing that was important about the Kennedys was JFK is actually America's first Catholic president. So up until that time, there had been a lot of anti-Catholic bias. Some of that dating back to, bad blood from Bloody Mary and the Spanish Inquisition and some of that stuff, but some of it was just ridiculous. And there was this kind of sense of, if we have a Catholic president, is the Pope really going to rule the country by pulling his strings? And Kennedy kind of overcomes that those questions and becomes the first Catholic to win election, which is kind of a big deal for America's Catholic population. And another thing I should add about JFK is that JFK kind of becomes this national. He was actually in reality, he's a horrible human being. Okay. His philandering and sexual immorality was on par with Bill Clinton's. In fact, there's increasingly kind of credible evidence that he did a few things on that count that were illegal. And so he really was a foul human being at a personal level. But most people didn't really know that side of him. In terms of the public, because this is the era where you only have 3 TV channels. It's not like you've got 24/7 partisan media like you have now, and so people just kind of saw the smiling face or whatever. I mean, people around town knew that he womanized or whatever, but I don't think people recognized the depravity of how horrible a human being he was. But that being said, he had this what they called Camelot. This kind of royal image that he and his family were kind of treated as like the closest thing America's had to like a royal family. And, his wife, Jackie Kennedy, was a very lovely woman, became, she was on every magazine cover and, all that kind of thing. And, you have this young couple and these young children, and it's the youngest president they ever had. And they just kind of created this public relations myth of this kind of of the White House as this, um, you know, I don't know, this utopia or whatever, which it turned out really wasn't like that behind the scenes. But nonetheless, people kind of projected a lot of hope onto this image of JFK, and so he was, someone that a lot of people, even though he made some rookie mistakes, like really botching the Bay of Pigs situation, but then he also did some really good things, like navigating the Cuban Missile Crisis that came out of it. But he kind of becomes this well loved figure in America, and then for no particular reason, they shot him, and we'll pick up JFK's story with the end of the story in just a couple videos. The poor guy. But until that time, you have yourselves a good day, and hopefully I'll see you all around later.